Perfect. Let's dive right into 1. I didn't mean to see the email. It had come accidentally. A stray forward from my mom, who had clearly intended it for someone else. I was standing in the lobby of the notary's office, my hands clammy around the folder of enrollment forms for the college program I'd been admitted to, when I opened it. The subject line was brutal in its simplicity. Control of educational trust. My stomach dropped at the sender's name. It wasn't hers. It was his, my ex-stepfather, the man my mother divorced nearly 5 years ago. Yet somehow his authority still clung to us like mildew in a forgotten corner. The words blurred as I skimmed them, but one sentence stayed sharp enough to slice me open. As trustee, I will continue to oversee dispersal until she demonstrates financial maturity. That word, maturity, seared me. The college fund wasn't his. It was my grandmother's last gift to me. And still, this man had turned it into a litmus test for whatever image he wanted to project. Suddenly, the air in the office felt thin. The ticking of the wall clock hammered against my temples. Every second a reminder that tuition deadlines were only weeks away. My first instinct was denial. Surely my mother, the one person who should stand with me, had fought this. Surely she hadn't agreed to let the man she left in every way but legal paperwork chokehold my future. But as I scrolled further, it wasn't just silence from her. It was compliance. She'd written, "As long as it looks orderly on the paperwork, that's fine." My lips went cold. She was trying to protect appearances. That was always her weak spot. Maintaining face in front of community, neighbors, family, friends. I remember gripping that printed tuition schedule in my lap until it crumpled. Why was I sitting in this sterile lobby, trying to prove myself, when what was mine was being siphoned behind closed doors? I felt a heat rising, a mix of humiliation and fury, and I knew something was about to erupt. If I didn't fight this now, everything I had worked for could vanish before I even filled out my first college registration form. But the real blow wasn't what was in the email. It was what wasn't. There was no mention of me, the actual beneficiary. I was reduced to a pawn, my name only existing as an obstacle or a justification. That erasure burned worse than theft. The secretary called my name, snapping the moment in two. The notary was ready. My feet felt stiff, but I rose. I thought, if he thinks I'll stay quiet, he doesn't know me at all. And yet, I also knew something darker. This wasn't just about money to him. It was about control, about shaping the narrative, about keeping power long after he'd lost it. So before I walked into that office, I had to gather myself, because if what I'd just read was true, the battle wasn't about tuition deadlines. It was about his grip on my life, and part of me feared he'd tighten it even further once I confronted him. Shall I write the next chapter? The moment I sat down in the notary's office, the weight of what I'd just discovered pressed harder against my chest. The folder in my lap now felt useless, almost laughable. Papers proving my acceptance, tuition breakdowns, housing estimates. None of it mattered if I couldn't access the one thing my grandmother had meant for me. The notary's desk was overly polished, the kind of dark wood that swallowed light. Behind it, a row of bound registers gleamed, lined up like silent witnesses. My ex-stepfather sat to my right, legs crossed in perfect composure, suit deliberately crisp, even though this meeting wasn't for him. He didn't belong here, and yet, somehow, he always was here, wherever money or decisions intersected. "You'll need his sign-off," the notary said with almost casual authority, confirming my dread. Her words landed like iron. I turned toward him slowly, fighting to keep my face neutral. He didn't look at me directly. He looked through me, eyes on the ceiling corner as though bored. My mother sat on his other side, posture tight, hands clasped around her handbag. She must have felt my stare burn into her, but she wouldn't meet my eye. She hadn't fought this. She hadn't done anything. For her, it was always less about fairness and more about not disrupting the image of an orderly family. Inside me, panic collided with fury. The deadline for the deposit loomed, and without that fund, I'd lose my chance at enrollment. This wasn't a question of pride. It was survival. The program was 3 states away, my first escape from this orbit, the culmination of all-nighters, essays, exams, letters of recommendation, and it was dangling, dependent on his permission. I remembered every little dismissal over the years, things that had seemed so small at the time. Him accidentally paying for my brother's extracurriculars while forgetting mine. Him saying a 16-year-old didn't need a checking account because it just complicates things. Him insisting that college choices should be realistic and close to home. Always framed as wisdom. Always papered as guidance. And always leaving me smaller, muted. Now, in the echo of the notary's explanation, it all crystallized. This wasn't about financial responsibility. This was about control. He had positioned himself as the gatekeeper of my future, even after the divorce. I managed to ask, my voice catching but firm enough, "Is this really the only way? That I have to go through him when he isn't even family anymore? When my grandmother never meant it this way?" The notary hesitated. She glanced between us, sensing the dynamic. My mother fiddled with her clasp, refusing to break the silence. He finally turned to me, lips curved in an almost paternal smile. "It's not about blocking you. It's about timing, about ensuring you're ready. You wouldn't want to waste such a gift by rushing into impulsive choices." Impulsive, reckless, emotional. He knew exactly what words to use to paint me as unfit. I wanted to shout, but my throat sealed with something heavier than anger. It was humiliation, raw and thick. He had reduced my ambitions to impulse while clerks and clerical silence pressed in. And my mother let him. Still, inside that humiliation, a sharper vow coils. If he expected me to fold under the weight of his language, he was wrong. But to outmaneuver him, I'd need proof. Something undeniable. And that's when I remembered the email, still open on my phone in my bag. Lines he'd never expect me to have seen. The question wasn't whether I'd fight. It was, how? Shall I write the next chapter? I walked out of that office with my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my bag strap. His words, impulsive, emotional, still rang in my ears like chains clinking shut, and my mother's silence was worse than anything he said. But underneath the humiliation, another feeling started bubbling. Rage sharpened into precision. Because the truth was, I had already caught him doing exactly what he kept accusing me of being unprepared for: irresponsibility. That email buried in my inbox wasn't just paperwork chatter. It hinted at something slippery he hoped I'd never discover. I thought back to the wording, how he'd written about protecting the fund by leveraging it temporarily. Leveraging. The kind of word business people use when they want to hide the fact they're gambling. On the train ride home, every tiny sound grated on me. The screech of brakes, the chatter of strangers. In my head, I replayed all those minor injustices I'd tolerated from him over the years, and realized they weren't minor at all. They were rehearsals. Like when he told the waiter to split the birthday cake bill just between my mom and me while he played the magnanimous guest. Or when he'd introduced me at my cousin's wedding not as his stepdaughter, but as just a kid who lives with us. Always little cuts, small enough to make me doubt myself afterward, like I was crazy for letting them sting. And that's how he always won. He made me look dramatic for noticing. My phone buzzed with a new message, right as the city lights blurred past. It was from Mom. Just 4 words. Don't make a scene. My throat clenched. She already knew I had questions, maybe even knew I'd seen the email. And instead of rallying behind me, she wanted containment. Presentation before blood. That text did something to me. It clarified the tightrope I'd been walking my whole life, between telling the truth and preserving her image. And suddenly, I realized, as long as I played by her rules, I'd never have ground to stand on. I opened my email app again and scrolled back to the message he'd written. Each sentence dripped with arrogance. As trustee, I decided, for now, I'll maintain discretion. I decided, I'll maintain. Not once did my name appear as an active subject. I was just a liability, someone to be managed. For the first time, I wondered, had he dipped into my fund for more than just leveraging? That thought froze me mid-breath. If I wanted to break free, I couldn't just argue with him. I needed proof. Something undeniable. Something even my mother couldn't ignore. I knew then that my next move wouldn't be polite or passive. I would dig. And what I found might not just topple his control. It could collapse the whole careful image my mother clung to. But if you think that scared me into hesitating, you're wrong. It electrified me. Because finally, the weakness wasn't mine. The weakness was his secret. Shall I write the next chapter? That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with the glow of my laptop burning my eyes as I sifted through every corner of my inbox, searching for threads, attachments, anything. The forwarded email had been a mistake. Rare, but telling. He never slipped. He was meticulous, controlled, calculated, and if he had let one thing slip, odds were there were more. At around 2:30 a.m., my heart jolted when I found it. An older email chain buried deep in the all-mail tab. It wasn't even addressed to me. My name was mentioned almost like an afterthought in a thread between him and some financial consultant. The subject line read, Trust Collateral Agreement Extension. I clicked it open and started reading. Each line was more damning than the last. He hadn't just frozen my college fund. He had used it as security for a private loan. He called it an elegant way to keep the assets working while the beneficiary matures. In plainer language, he had gambled my grandmother's last gift to me on his own venture. My stomach flipped. I grabbed my phone immediately and snapped screenshots of everything. The headers, the dates, the smug tone about how appearances must remain orderly. At one point in the thread, he even wrote, She'll never know. It's better this way. She'll never know. I dropped my phone onto the blanket and covered my face with my hands. The audacity of it made my skin prickle. It wasn't just theft. It was gaslighting. All those years of lecturing me about my supposed immaturity, while he siphoned the one safety net meant for my future. At that moment, I felt an icy clarity. There would be no reasoning with him. If I approached him gently with questions, he'd bury me in louder words, in carefully staged paternal concern, in that smirk that always made me feel small. No. This time, I needed to bring sunlight, enough that even he couldn't twist it. But another realization cut deeper. If I exposed this, my mother would be collateral damage too. Her precious image of control and order would shatter because she had enabled it, even if out of willful blindness. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the creak of pipes, knowing sleep would never come, while this man still held my future hostage. By morning, my eyes were raw, but my resolve was sharper than it had ever been. I had screenshots. I had leverage, but I also had risk. If the notary or any institution thought the funds had been tampered with, it could trigger a freeze, even longer than the wait I feared now, which meant I couldn't just blow this open in a rage. I'd have to pick the right moment, the right room, and the right witnesses. And that is why, as the sun came up, I decided the next meeting at the notary's office would not be a negotiation. It would be an exposure. But before that confrontation, I needed to test one thing, to see how he'd react if I hinted that I knew. Shall I write the next chapter? The next morning, I walked into the kitchen where my mother was sipping coffee. The air scented with that burnt toast smell she never seemed to notice. She looked up, startled, like she hadn't expected me awake so early. Her smile was thin, brittle, the kind people wear before asking you to just be reasonable. For a second, I thought of blurting out everything. The screenshots, the smug phrases burned into my brain. Instead, I slid into the chair opposite her and tested the waters. "Do you ever wonder what Grandma actually wanted?" I asked. My tone sounded casual, but my chest was pounding. Her mug paused mid-air. "She wanted you taken care of. You know that." "Taken care of," I repeated softly. So, what would she think if someone was using my fund to, I don't know, cover their own projects? I let the words hang. My mom's eyes flickered just long enough for me to know she understood exactly what I was implying. But instead of alarm, her face hardened, cheeks tinging with pink. "That's not how it is," she snapped. Too quick, too rehearsed. "You've misunderstood." My insides twisted. There it was, gaslighting, secondhand this time. Not from him, but from her. Like she'd absorbed his tactics. I pressed further. "Then explain it to me. Explain why he's still involved at all. Explain why a grown woman has to ask her mother's ex-husband for permission to use money her grandmother left her." Her jaw clenched, nostrils flaring like she wanted to scold me back into silence. "Because he knows how to handle these things. He's better at appearances. If it looks orderly, then there are no problems later. Do you want distant relatives gossiping that the trust wasn't managed properly?" There it was. That same motive. Appearances. Always, always appearances. I nearly laughed. My dreams and future being held hostage. All so no loose thread of scandal ever trailed behind her. "Mom," I said quietly, "don't you see how twisted this is? That you care more about what some cousin thinks at Thanksgiving than whether I can start my life." But instead of cracking, she rolled her eyes, the way she used to when I whined at 12 about unfair curfews. "You're being dramatic again. You have to stop making everything a fight. He's just trying to shape this into something stable." Stable for who? The question tore out sharper than I meant. Her silence was my answer. At that moment, anger at him blurred into something more painful. Betrayal by her. She wouldn't protect me. She never would, not when protecting me meant risking her image. So I smiled, too brightly, too calmly, and stood. "You're right, maybe I am dramatic, but you'll see. You'll both see." Inside, my chest roared. I couldn't fight this with appeals to fairness, not with a man who thrived off control, and a mother addicted to appearances. The only weapon I had left was the truth. And if I wanted it to matter, I'd have to time my strike when both of them, and the notary, were in the same room, when no one could twist away. So I texted the notary's office that afternoon, requesting another meeting. My hand didn't even shake when they offered me a slot 2 days later, with all parties required present. Because this time, I wasn't coming to negotiate. I was coming to detonate. Shall I write the next chapter? 2 days later, when I walked back into the notary's office, the whole building felt different. The air was tight with the kind of tension you can smell, like stale paper and reheated coffee. My knees trembled under my skirt, but my jaw was locked. Everything I had gathered, the screenshots, the email thread, even a printed copy in case anyone mysteriously lost digital access, I had tucked into a neat folder. It bulged inside my bag like a secret weapon. He was already there when I arrived, perched in the corner like a king awaiting his subjects. Perfect posture, legs crossed, phone in hand, scrolling as if this business was beneath him. And of course, my mother beside him, her wrists folded like a nervous child. She didn't look at me when I entered. The notary called us in without small talk. Inside that wood-paneled office, the silence throbbed. Papers shuffled, pens tapped. My ex-stepfather launched into his calculated performance, smooth, reasonable, calm, explaining how trustee oversight was necessary. How a college-aged young lady can't possibly be expected to foresee every financial repercussion. How our duty as adults was to pace things responsibly. Every phrase was a blade hidden in sugar. I nodded at first, deliberately still. I wanted him comfortable. And then I nudged. Just a little. You keep talking about responsibility as though you've never put this fund at risk. The shift in his posture was microscopic, but real. He froze just long enough for me to see through the mask. Then he chuckled low, shaking his head. You've been reading things you don't understand. Half information is more dangerous than ignorance. There it was, the hook he always used to lure me back into doubt. But this time, I didn't flinch. I tilted my head slowly, studying him the same way he studied me for years. Then you'll have no problem with me reading the whole thing aloud. I pulled the folder from my bag. My mother gasped, a tiny wounded sound, but I didn't look at her. I met his eyes as I slid the screenshots across the table, one after another. Printouts of his words. Leveraging the trust. Temporary collateral. She'll never know. The room compressed. The notary leaned forward, squinting, lips pursed like she'd just bitten into something sour. My mother's face went white. For the first time in my life, I watched his confidence falter. He reached for the pages with a speed he couldn't disguise, as if by grabbing them fast enough he could dissolve their meaning. I pulled my hand back, sharp. Don't. These are mine, my grandmother's fund, my future. My voice cracked, but steadied again. And if you want to keep talking about responsibility, let's start with this. The notary raised her eyebrows at him, then turned to me. If what she's presenting is accurate. Her words trailed. She didn't have to finish. We all knew. My mother whispered his name, half pleading, half terrified. He cleared his throat, shrugged, tried to gather himself. But his "you misunderstood" charm was thinner now, cracking like cheap paint. And as I watched him scramble for spin, half the fear I carried all these years evaporated. He wasn't untouchable. He was exposed. Still, the real question wasn't whether I had cornered him. It was what he would do now that he'd been cornered. Shall I write the next chapter? His reaction came slow at first, like a machine trying to reboot after a sudden power outage. His fingers drummed once against the desk, then stopped. He inhaled, forced a laugh that didn't land, and finally looked at me the way someone does when the mask slips, and all that's left is bare calculation. You don't understand how these agreements work, he said, but the certainty was gone from his tone. He leaned back in his chair, trying to reassemble his composure. Leveraging isn't stealing. It's common practice. It safeguards the fund, keeps it growing instead of sitting idle. The notary didn't respond immediately. She kept her eyes fixed on the papers. Next to him, my mother finally broke her silence, her voice trembling. Is this true? When he hesitated a fraction of a second before answering, the crack widened like a fault line. He turned to her, eyes hard. Appearances matter, don't they? If anyone asks, the trust has been orderly. No one can accuse us of negligence. Do you really want our family looking careless? Our family. Even now, when he wasn't even family. Watching him try to drag my mother back into his orbit by appealing to her obsession with image made my hands clench into fists. You didn't just leverage numbers in a portfolio, I cut in, my voice sharp, steady now. You leveraged my life. My enrollment depends on that fund. My future depends on it. And you were willing to gamble both so you could play the part of Mr. Successful on paper. Something flickered across my mother's face then. For once, she wasn't looking at him, but at me. Really looking. That landed heavier than anything I'd said. The notary finally cleared her throat. Regardless of intent, using a beneficiary's trust as collateral without disclosure is questionable. The documentation here suggests unilateral action. His jaw tightened. That was the moment control slipped from his grasp. He reached for the narrative, spinning fast. She's painting this as some betrayal, but the truth is, I've protected her from herself. She's impulsive, reckless. Stop! My voice slammed across the table. His words bounced into silence. You don't get to say that anymore. You don't get to define me as reckless while you're the one gambling with what isn't yours. The room fell into a tense stillness, so heavy I could hear the tick of the notary's clock on the wall. For the first time, I saw it. He wasn't speaking to me anymore. He was speaking to her, to my mother, desperate to keep her loyalty intact. But her face was pale, conflicted, her hands locked together as though bracing herself against an earthquake. And in that moment, I knew the real battle wasn't just him versus me. It was him and my mother's silence versus my proof. The notary adjusted her glasses and sighed, preparing to outline next steps. I realized then that this was no longer just a fight of words. It was about to become something with real legal financial teeth. And if he was cornered, I didn't trust that he wouldn't strike back in some unexpected, destructive way. Shall I write the next chapter? He did strike back, not with fists, not even with raised volume, but with the kind of precision I'd learned to fear, the polished venom he always saved for when he was cornered. If you want to drag this into a legal fight, he said smoothly, lace of smugness winding back into his tone, then understand what you're risking. Once you cry fraud, once you push for intervention, the entire fund could get frozen. Frozen for years. Court fees, investigations, reviews of every transaction. You think tuition deadlines are stressful? Try litigation. By the time you're done, your precious program will be long gone, and you'll be stuck back home. Is that what you really want? The notary frowned. That isn't necessarily the outcome. But he cut her off with a raised hand, confident again, reclaiming airspace like he owned it. My pulse pounded. Of course he had anticipated this. Of course he had a way to make truth itself a threat, to twist exposure into punishment. He was betting I'd protect myself by staying quiet. That fear of losing everything would outweigh my willingness to fight. I looked at my mother. Her lips were pressed tight, her eyes locked downward on her clasped hands. She wanted me to fold. That much was obvious. She wanted the scene to end, the mess to shrink to whispers. Don't make this harder than it has to be, he added, turning his gaze back to me. His voice softened now, almost fatherly. If you just wait, prove you're ready. Time is on your side. But if you play the victim, you'll destroy the very thing you're fighting for. It was surreal, watching him layer manipulation and threat beneath a performance of calm reason. For a second, doubt seeped in. What if he was right? What if going nuclear meant I ended up with nothing but a frozen account and a shattered chance at school? Then I remembered that line from his email. She'll never know. That wasn't the reasoning of a benevolent trustee. That was the sneer of a man who thrived on unchecked control. I leaned forward, the tension in the room sharpening every word I spoke. You're right about one thing. Litigation costs time. But you're forgetting something. You also live on your reputation. You built your entire persona on being trustworthy, clean, reliable. What happens when those emails are entered into record? What happens when people see you took a girl's college fund and treated it like your poker chip? This time it was his turn to pale. Not much, just a shade, but enough. Because I'd hit what he feared. Exposure. Not losing money, losing face. The notary cleared her throat again, pen tapping against her pad. I will need to prepare a report outlining possible breaches of fiduciary duty, she said carefully. My mother finally lifted her head, eyes darting between me and him, wavering, shaking. There has to be another way. And right then, in her plea for another way, I realized the power had shifted. For the first time, he wasn't dictating the battle. I was. But if I was truly going to win this, not just shake him temporarily, I needed to press further. To draw the line he could not cross without shattering his image completely, which meant making a choice that terrified me, going public, beyond this office, where whispers became records. Shall I write the next chapter? I could feel the moment tipping, like a glass right at the edge of a table. One shove would send everything crashing down. He knew it. I knew it. Even my mother knew it, the way her hands trembled against her handbag. Publicity is poison, he muttered, almost to himself, but I heard him. His voice had dropped the silky tone, stripped bare of affect. He wasn't worried about legal processes, not really. He was worried about being seen. His entire identity, family man, reliable advisor, respectable figure, would wither the moment his arrogance hit daylight. That realization churned into resolve. Then, I guess it's simple, I said quietly. You can either sign the transfer now, releasing the funds to me as intended, or I make these emails part of the record. They'll be scanned, filed, and accessible to anyone who knows how to look. My mother gasped. Don't! It wasn't directed at him. It was at me. Her panic wasn't about my loss, but about the cracks in her spotless facade. She would rather I sacrificed my future than let the neighbors whisper that her ex-husband bled money from his stepdaughter's trust. That realization sliced me deeper than his smugness ever had. He leaned forward suddenly, voice dripping quiet fury. You think you're brave, but you're reckless. If you go down this road, you won't just shame me, you'll shame her. He tilted his chin toward my mother, knowing exactly where my softest spot had always been. For a second, my throat tightened. Shame her. The one thing I'd bent myself into knots avoiding. The one hook he'd always used to keep me quiet. But then I remembered every compromise I'd already swallowed. The boyfriend I couldn't introduce because he thought it would look wrong. The summer job he made me decline because a trust beneficiary shouldn't mop floors. The college options I was guilted out of because they weren't on brand. How much of me had already been buried for the sake of protecting their image? I straightened my shoulders. If her shame comes from me telling the truth, then maybe that shame belongs to her, not me. My own words surprised me. They left my lips steadier than I felt inside. The notary's pen scratched against the pad. I must advise immediate restructuring. If these documents are verified, she trailed, her meaning obvious. He could be stripped of control. He opened his mouth to argue, but I slid my phone across the table before he could. My finger hovered over the forward button. One tap, and every lawyer in the office would have a copy of his words. His eyes locked onto mine, wide for just a heartbeat. I had never seen him look that way, cornered, not by bluster or spin, but by me. That was the breaking point. He slammed his fist softly, deliberately, against the arm of the chair. Fine. Take it all. But when it collapses, when you regret this, don't come back to me. My mother flinched. The notary lifted her brows and began shuffling the official forms that would begin the transfer process. I exhaled, air rushing out like I'd been holding my breath for years. But as the printer began to hum and the papers rolled out, I realized something huge. Winning this might save my future, but it would destroy the last scraps of my relationship with my mother. Because in her eyes, I hadn't just defied him. I had humiliated her. The real question was, could I live with that? Shall I write the next chapter? My mother's silence that day was louder than his threats. She didn't speak as the notary slid the documents across the table, didn't move when I reached for the pen, didn't even blink when her ex, once her chosen partner, leaned back with a sneer so venomous it might have melted glass. As I signed my name, the room felt both electric and suffocating. This was the moment I'd fought for, the moment I cut his hand from my future. But instead of triumph, what settled over me was grief. Not for him, for her. When the notary dismissed us, he left quickly, his cologne trailing behind like smoke from a fire. I half expected him to turn back with one last cutting remark, but he didn't. That told me everything. He wasn't retreating because of me. He was retreating because his image had cracked, and cracked in front of witnesses. His war wasn't over, but the battlefield had shifted. It was my mother who lingered, still glued to her chair. The notary gave a polite nod, sensing the standoff, and excused herself. We were alone in that paneled office, drowning in unspoken words. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes weren't angry. They were wounded, almost frantic. "Do you know what you've done?" Her voice was soft but carried a weight that pressed like stone. "Yes," I said. My throat was dry, but my voice held steady. "I've done what you should have done years ago." Her lips quivered. She shook her head slowly. "You embarrassed me today. You made a spectacle. People will talk." The words punched harder than I expected. Even now, it wasn't about what he'd done, what I'd been put through, or the danger to my future. It was about gossip, perception, whispers in the grocery aisle. She was grieving the death of her perfect facade, not the risk to her daughter's life plans. Tears I hadn't expected stung my eyes. "Mom, he stole from me. He gambled your mother's gift. And you're worried about appearances?" Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. And in that silence, I understood something final and irreversible. She might never be the ally I kept wishing her to be. Loving her would always mean losing pieces of myself to protect her mask. When we stepped out of the notary's office into the sharp afternoon sun, it felt like a different world. I had the papers in my hand. The fund was mine again. My future was back on track. But walking next to her, the distance between us had never felt wider. She leaned close, whispering as though microphones hid in the bushes. "Couldn't you have handled it more quietly?" That was the last straw. I stopped walking and looked her dead in the eye. No. Quiet is what kept him in control. Quiet is what let you stand by and do nothing. I'm done being quiet. Her face shut down, like a curtain being drawn. She turned and walked briskly toward the car without waiting for me. I stood there a moment, clutching the folder. The victory tasted bitter, but it was still victory. For the first time in years, the weight pressing on my chest wasn't his. It wasn't hers. It had lifted, leaving space for something new. Choice. It dawned on me then that reclaiming my college fund wasn't the only thing I had taken back today. I had taken back my voice. And if that made me the villain in my mother's story, then so be it. At least, finally, I was no longer erased in my own. But the question haunted me as I watched her retreating figure. Could a daughter truly rebuild a future when her mother chose silence over love? Shall I write the next chapter? I didn't follow her to the car right away. I stood outside the notary's office, feeling the heat of the sun on my shoulders, and watching people rush past on the sidewalk. People with easy errands, groceries, coffee cups, school pickups. For them, the day was ordinary. For me, the ground had shifted permanently. By the time I slid into the passenger seat, the silence was suffocating. My mother's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. We drove for blocks without a word, the hum of the engine the only sound between us. It was unbearable, but I forced myself to sit in it, forced myself not to fill it with the apologies she was waiting to hear. Finally, she spoke. "You've ruined things more than you realize." Her words hit like glass shattering. Part of me still hoped she'd say she was proud of me, that she was glad I fought for myself even if it had been messy. But no, her disappointment was deeper than the betrayal itself. In her eyes, I hadn't liberated myself. I had humiliated her. "How can you even say that?" I hissed, turning toward her. "He risked everything Grandma saved for me. He lied over and over, and you let him. And I'm the one who ruined things?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't understand the messiness of adulthood. You don't understand what keeping a family together requires." I cut her off before she could spin it into another sermon about appearances. "No, Mom. What you don't understand is that keeping a family together shouldn't come at the cost of sacrificing your own child. You chose him every single time. You chose his version of order over my reality." The car screeched to a halt at a red light. She stared forward, breathing fast. For a moment, I thought she might yell, but instead, her voice cracked into something smaller, brittle. "You don't know what it's like to be left, to be ashamed, to have people whisper about your failures. I couldn't let that happen again." The truth behind her choices tumbled out. Fear. Not love, not logic. Just her fear of looking abandoned, of looking weak. My chest ached, torn between pity and fury. "Mom," I said quietly, "I can live with people whispering about our family. What I can't live with is having no future. He took that from me, and you let him. But I won't let either of you define me anymore." The light turned green, and we rolled forward again, but she said nothing. And in that silence, the final thread snapped. I understood fully. I had won the battle for my grandmother's gift, but I had lost the illusion that my mother would ever value truth over image. Still, in that loss, there was strange freedom. Because now I knew the rules. Now I knew the limits. And knowing them meant I could stop begging for things she was never going to give. As the campus acceptance letter peeked from the folder in my lap, I felt a flicker of something that almost startled me. Something like hope. The fallout was real. The rift between us was real. But so was my escape. And the next chapter of my life, the one outside his shadow and hers, was finally beginning. Shall I write the next chapter?